The house sat at the end of a quiet street, the kind where mornings were slow and evenings were calm. Neighbors waved when they passed, lawns were trimmed on weekends, and nothing much ever happened that people talked about for long. The homeowner had lived there for years without trouble. He paid his dues on time, kept his place neat, and followed the rules as best as he understood them. He liked peace and routine. He believed that if you didn't bother others, they wouldn't bother you. That belief worked fine until the HOA board changed. At first, the changes seemed small. A notice was pinned to the community board about renewed focus on standards. Another email followed about consistency and enforcement. Most people skimmed past it. HOA emails came and went all the time. They usually meant nothing more than reminders about trash, cans, or parking. Then the letters started showing up in his mailbox. The first one said his grass was half an inch too high. It included a blurry photo taken from the street. He stood outside afterward, staring at his lawn, trying to understand how anyone could even measure that difference. He shrugged it off and mowed again, even though he had already done it 2 days earlier. The second letter arrived the next week. This time, it was about the color of a storage bin barely visible behind his fence. The rule quoted was vague, something about approved tones. He read it twice and still couldn't see how it applied to him. He moved the bin anyway just to avoid trouble. By the third letter, something felt off. It mentioned repeated noncompliance and warned of possible fines. The wording was sharp, almost personal. It didn't feel like a standard notice anymore. It felt like someone was watching him. He attended the next HOA meeting to clear things up. The room was small, filled with folding chairs and tired faces. Most people came only when they felt forced to. At the front sat the board members. That was when he first really noticed her. She spoke often and loudly, correcting others, interrupting, pointing at papers as if they were weapons. She talked about standards and discipline with a tight smile that never reached her eyes. When someone asked a simple question, she sighed like it was a burden to explain. When the homeowner mentioned the letters, she looked straight at him. She said rules were rules. She said enforcement was finally being taken seriously. She said people who had nothing to hide shouldn't feel attacked. Her tone was calm, but there was something sharp underneath it. After the meeting, he tried to speak to her privately. He explained that he was confused and wanted to make sure he was following everything correctly. She nodded, but her answers were short. She told him to read the guidelines more carefully and suggested that maybe he wasn't as compliant as he thought. From that moment on, the notices came faster. One complained about a crack in his driveway that had been there long before the HOA existed. Another mentioned outdoor furniture placement, even though several neighbors had similar setups. He started taking photos of nearby houses, not to report them, but to reassure himself that he wasn't imagining the unfairness. What bothered him most wasn't the rules. It was the feeling of being targeted. He began to notice a car parked across the street more often than usual. He noticed someone slowing down when passing his house. Once, he saw her standing near the sidewalk, phone raised, clearly taking pictures. When their eyes met, she didn't look away. At night, he lay awake replaying the day in his head. He wondered if he had done something wrong without realizing it. He wondered if speaking up at the meeting had marked him somehow. He wondered how something so small had become such a heavy weight. Neighbors started asking quiet questions. One mentioned seeing the notices on his door. Another joked that he must be popular with the board. Someone else warned him to be careful. They had all had minor run-ins with the HOA Karen, but none as constant as his. Still, no one wanted to get involved. The next letter included a fine. It wasn't a large amount, but it felt like a line had been crossed. The reason listed was unclear, citing ongoing violations without specifics. He read it slowly, his hands shaking just enough for him to notice. This wasn't about keeping the neighborhood nice anymore. This was about control. He paid the fine to avoid immediate trouble, but something inside him shifted. Paying didn't bring relief. It brought anger, quiet and steady. He started keeping everything. Letters, envelopes, dates, photos. He saved emails and took screenshots. He wrote down times and brief notes after each interaction. He didn't tell anyone what he was doing. He just felt the need to protect himself. One afternoon, while trimming a bush, she walked by and stopped. She pointed out another issue, something about the shape of the hedge. Her voice was polite, but her eyes were cold. He listened without interrupting, nodded, and said he would look into it. As she walked away, she reminded him that repeat violations could lead to serious consequences. That was the moment he understood this wasn't going to stop on its own. The stress started to affect his daily life. He checked his mailbox with dread. He avoided spending time in his yard. Simple tasks felt heavy. A place that once felt safe now felt watched. Friends told him to ignore it, to move if it got too bad, to stop caring. But it was his home. He had worked for it. He refused to be pushed out quietly at the next HOA meeting. She spoke again about problem properties. She didn't say his address, but everyone knew. Her words were wrapped in professionalism, but the message was clear. He sat silently, jaw tight, choosing not to react. After the meeting, another board member approached him quietly. They said nothing directly, only that things had gotten a bit intense lately. It was said with an uncomfortable smile, like an apology without words. That night, he sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by papers. He read the HOA bylaws line by line, slower than he ever had before. He highlighted sections, compared rules to notices, and made notes in the margins. The language was confusing, but patterns began to appear. Some rules were flexible. Some required warnings before fines. Some required votes. The letters he received followed none of those steps. He realized something important then. The HOA Karen wasn't just strict, she was careless. Or maybe she thought no one would challenge her. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. Lights glowed softly in windows. Life went on as usual for everyone else. But for him, a line had been crossed. And there was no going back to pretending it was nothing. He didn't know yet how far this would go. He didn't know who would stand with him or against him. He only knew that staying silent had already cost him peace, and if someone wanted to make his life difficult, they had picked the wrong person to underestimate. The next few weeks felt heavier than the ones before. The homeowner woke up every morning with the same tight feeling in his chest. Before coffee, before checking his phone, he checked outside. He looked at the yard, the driveway, the fence, as if searching for mistakes that might already be there. Things he had never worried about before now felt dangerous. The letters didn't stop. They changed. Now they sounded more official. The language was firmer, colder. Words like final notice and escalation appeared more often. Some letters arrived only days apart. One even arrived on a weekend, slipped under his door like a warning meant to unsettle him. What confused him most was that some of the complaints contradicted earlier ones. He was told to move an item, then later told it was not allowed to be moved there either. He was told to trim a tree, then warned that trimming it too much would be another violation. It felt like a trap that shifted every time he stepped carefully. He tried reaching out calmly. He sent emails asking for clarity. He asked for written explanations and exact rule references. The replies were short and unhelpful. Sometimes they came days later, sometimes not at all. When they did come, they often quoted rules without explaining how he had broken them. Once, he received a reply that simply said he should already know better by now. That line stayed with him. At the next HOA meeting, he spoke again, this time more carefully. He asked about the process for warnings and fines. He asked whether there was a review system. He asked if homeowners could appeal. The room grew uncomfortable. The HOA Karen answered before anyone else could. She said appeals were unnecessary when violations were clear. She said time was wasted when people argued instead of complying. She smiled while saying it, but her voice had an edge. He noticed something then. Other board members avoided eye contact. One looked down at the table. Another shuffled papers. No one challenged her. After the meeting, a neighbor caught up with him in the parking lot. They spoke quietly, looking around as if being overheard mattered. The neighbors said they had received a warning too, once. They paid a fine, even though they didn't agree with it. It was easier that way, they said. Fighting only made things worse. That advice scared him more than it helped. Soon the fines increased. One notice claimed he had failed to correct an issue that he knew he had already fixed. He took photos, sent them as proof, and waited. The response came days later. It said the photos were inconclusive. He felt like he was being told his own reality wasn't valid. The stress followed him everywhere. At work, he caught himself rereading the same email over and over. At night, he dreamed about knocking on doors, about being surrounded by papers he couldn't escape. His home no longer felt like a place to rest. It felt like a test he was always failing. One afternoon, he came home to find a bright sticker on his front door. It warned of possible legal action if compliance was not achieved. The color was loud, meant to be seen by anyone passing by. His face burned with embarrassment as he peeled it off. That was the day it stopped feeling professional and started feeling personal. He began to notice patterns. Complaints came shortly after HOA meetings. Photos were taken from specific angles that made things look worse than they were. The timing felt intentional, almost strategic. Once, while taking out the trash, he saw her again. She stood across the street, phone in hand. She didn't pretend this time. She lifted the phone openly and snapped photos. When he asked what she was doing, she said she was documenting. Her voice was calm. To calm, he asked her to stop taking pictures of his home without permission. She told him she didn't need permission. She reminded him that by living there, he agreed to oversight. The way she said oversight made it sound like ownership. That night, he felt something settle inside him. Not fear, not anger exactly. It was resolve. He stopped reacting emotionally. He stopped explaining himself over and over. Instead, he focused on records. He created folders. He labeled everything by date. He printed copies and stored digital backups. He read every line of the bylaws again, slower this time. Making notes, he noticed that some of the rules she enforced were listed as optional guidelines, not requirements. Others required warnings that he had never received. Some fines required board approval that he suspected never happened. The more he read, the clearer it became. This wasn't strict enforcement. This was misuse of authority. Meanwhile, the HOA Karen grew bolder. She began mentioning his property during meetings more often. Always indirectly. Always framed as concern for the community. She used phrases like certain homeowners and ongoing issues, letting people fill in the blanks. People started whispering. A neighbor asked him if everything was okay. Another suggested he apologize, even if he wasn't wrong, just to make peace. Someone else avoided him entirely, as if trouble were contagious. The isolation hurt more than he expected. Then came the letter that changed. Everything had stated that if the violations continued, the HOA would consider placing a lien on his home. The words were heavy, frightening. He read it 3 times before it sank in. This wasn't just about fines anymore. This was about threatening his home. His hands shook as he folded. The paper, he didn't sleep that night in the early morning hours. Sitting alone at his kitchen table, he realized something important. This situation wasn't going to resolve itself. Waiting had only made it worse. Being polite had not protected him. Silence had been taken as permission. He decided then that he would stop playing defense. He didn't announce it. He didn't confront anyone. He simply began preparing. He contacted the HOA in writing, requesting copies of all violation reports, photos, and board approvals related to his property. He cited specific sections of the bylaws that required transparency. He sent the message calmly, professionally, and kept a copy. The response was delayed. When it came, it was defensive. The HOA Karen accused him of being difficult. She warned him again about consequences. She didn't provide the documents he asked for. That omission mattered. He shared nothing publicly yet. But word spread quietly. A few neighbors approached him privately asking questions. They had concerns of their own. Stories began to sound familiar. Sudden fines. Vague warnings. Fear of pushing back. The problem was bigger than just him. At the next meeting, he didn't speak much. He listened. He observed. He noticed how she dominated the room. How she dismissed questions. how she framed disagreement as disrespect. He noticed how tired everyone looked. After the meeting, one board member stayed behind. They spoke softly. The board member didn't criticize her directly, but they admitted things had gotten out of hand. They said they hoped things would settle down soon. He nodded, but inside he knew better. Things only settle when pressure is released. And right now, all the pressure was being pushed onto him. Driving home that night, he looked at the houses lining the street. Each one held someone's life, their memories, their sense of safety. He wondered how many others felt watched. How many stayed quiet out of fear? He pulled into his driveway and sat in his car for a long moment before going inside. This wasn't just about defending himself anymore. It was about stopping someone who believed. Power meant never being questioned, and she had no idea how. Carefully, he had been paying attention. The days after that meeting felt strangely calm on the surface. But underneath, everything was moving. The homeowner didn't rush. He didn't argue. He didn't send emotional messages late at night. Instead, he treated the situation like a long game, one that required patience more than strength. Every morning, he followed a routine. Coffee, a quick walk around his property, photos from the same angles each time. He noted dates, weather, and any changes. It felt strange at first, like he was turning his life into a report, but it gave him control. The fear slowly loosened its grip. He spent evenings reading. Not just the HOA bylaws, but state property laws, homeowner rights, and public records. He learned which rules were enforceable and which were suggestions dressed up as commands. He learned that boards had limits, even when they acted like they didn't. One detail stood out again and again. Proper process mattered. Warnings had to come before fines. Violations had to be clearly described. Homeowners had the right to respond. Board members could not act alone, and yet, nearly everything done to him ignored those rules. He requested records again, this time more formally. He cited laws, not opinions. He asked for meeting minutes, vote records, and enforcement logs. He didn't accuse. He simply asked. Days passed without an answer. Instead, another notice appeared. This one claimed a new violation, something so minor it almost felt insulting. He laughed once, short and dry, then filed it carefully. He could feel her trying to provoke him. Neighbors noticed the shift in him. He no longer looked tense when checking the mail. He waved again. He stood taller. When someone asked how things were going, he answered honestly, but calmly. Word traveled faster than he expected. One neighbor stopped by in the evening, standing a little too close to the door like they didn't want to be seen. They said they admired how he was handling things. They said they had always felt uneasy but didn't know how to push back. He listened more than he spoke. That conversation changed something. Soon after, another neighbor shared an old email. Another mentioned a fine from years ago that never made sense. None of them wanted to be the first to stand up, but they were watching him closely. At the next HOA meeting, he came prepared. He brought a folder, neat and organized. He didn't interrupt, but he waited. When the time came for open discussion, he stood slowly and spoke clearly. He asked about enforcement procedures. He asked whether individual board members were allowed to issue violations alone. He asked how fines were approved. The room went quiet. The HOA Karen answered quickly, her voice sharp. She said the board trusted her judgment. She said efficiency mattered. She said too many questions slowed progress. He nodded and thanked her. Then he asked one more thing. He asked to see the board votes approving his fines. She hesitated. She said those details could be discussed privately. She suggested moving on. The chair of the meeting shifted uncomfortably. That hesitation spoke louder than words. After the meeting, 2 board members approached him separately. One admitted they hadn't seen all the notices being sent. The other said they assumed everything was being handled correctly. Both seemed uneasy. The next morning, an email finally arrived from the HOA. It included some documents, but not all. Dates were missing. Photos were unlabeled. There were no vote records. It was incomplete, and that mattered. He replied politely, listing what was still missing. He gave a deadline. That deadline passed. Instead of documents, another warning came. This one warning him against harassing the board with excessive requests. Reading that line, he felt something close to disbelief. Asking for records about his own home was now being called harassment. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he made copies of everything and scheduled a consultation with a local property rights advisor. He didn't dramatize the situation. He simply laid out the facts. The advisor listened carefully, flipping through the pages, occasionally raising an eyebrow. By the end, the advisor leaned back and said something simple. "None of this looks right." Those words brought relief he hadn't realized he needed. He wasn't imagining it. He wasn't being difficult. He wasn't wrong with guidance. He drafted a formal letter. It was respectful, firm, and clear. It outlined the violations of procedure, requested immediate correction, and warned that continued action without compliance would be challenged. He sent it by certified mail. The reaction was fast. Within days, the tone changed. Emails became more cautious. Notices slowed. The HOA Karen still spoke firmly, but something in her confidence had cracked. She stopped taking photos openly. She stopped confronting him in person. At the next meeting, she seemed tense. She spoke less. When questions were asked, she deferred more often. Board members began to speak up, asking for clarification, asking for votes, asking for records. He sat quietly, watching the shift. Neighbors who once stayed silent now asked questions too. Not aggressive ones, just reasonable ones. About transparency, about fairness. The atmosphere changed. Then something unexpected happened. A letter arrived from the HOA stating that some fines were under review. No apology. No explanation. Just a review. It was enough to confirm what he already knew. He continued documenting everything. He continued responding only in writing. He remained calm, even when provoked, especially when provoked. One afternoon, he saw her again on the sidewalk. This time, she didn't stop. She didn't take photos. She walked past without a word, eyes straight ahead. The power dynamic had shifted, but he didn't relax. He knew better. People who lose control often look for other ways to regain it. Sure enough, the next meeting agenda included a proposal for stricter enforcement rules. More authority, fewer steps, less oversight. He read it carefully and smiled. This time, he wasn't alone. Several homeowners attended who hadn't shown up in years. They asked questions. They requested delays. They asked for legal review. The proposal was tabled. The HOA Karen looked stunned. After the meeting, a small group gathered outside. They talked openly for the first time. They shared experiences. They compared notices. Patterns became obvious. He listened, quietly proud, not of himself, but of what was happening. This was never about winning an argument. It was about reminding people that authority only works when it follows rules. That night, he organized his files one more time. He backed everything up. He labeled folders clearly. He prepared for whatever came next. He didn't know how far this would go. He didn't know how she would respond. But he knew one thing for certain now. She no longer controlled the narrative, and that scared her far more than any argument ever could. The review mentioned in the letter did not happen quietly. It stirred something in the neighborhood that had been buried for a long time. People started paying attention. Not loudly at first, but in small ways. More lights were on during evening walks. More people lingered after meetings. More questions were asked in emails. That included everyone instead of private replies. The homeowner noticed the shift. Right away, the HOA Karen noticed it too. At the next meeting, the room was fuller than usual. Chairs were pulled closer together. Some people stood along the wall. The air felt tight, like everyone knew something important was about to happen. Even if they couldn't say what, the meeting started the same way it always did. Routine updates. Budget talk. Maintenance plans. The HOA Karen spoke when she could, but her voice didn't carry the room like before. She kept glancing at the papers in front of her, then at the faces watching her. When it was time to discuss enforcement, the chair mentioned the word review. That was all it took. The homeowner raised his hand. His heart beat faster, but his voice stayed calm. He didn't accuse anyone. He didn't raise old emotions. He simply asked for clarification. He asked what was being reviewed, who was reviewing it, and what process would be followed. The HOA Karen leaned forward quickly, ready to answer. But before she could, another board member spoke. They said the review involved checking whether procedures had been followed correctly. They said it was about transparency. That word hung in the air. The homeowner then asked if homeowners could see the results of the review once it was done. He asked if fines under review would be paused. Silence followed. People shifted in their seats. Someone cleared their throat. The HOA Karen finally spoke, saying these details didn't need to be discussed publicly. She said too much openness could cause confusion. That's when a neighbor stood up. They said confusion already existed. They said they had received a fine years ago and never understood why. Another neighbor spoke next, then another. Each story was different, but the feeling was the same. Vague notices. No clear explanations. Fear of pushing back. The homeowner sat quietly, listening. This wasn't what he had planned, but it was exactly what needed to happen. The chair called for order, but not sharply. There was no anger in the room, only something closer to relief. Like people had been holding their breath for years and were finally letting it out. The HOA Karen looked cornered. She spoke again, louder this time, defending her actions. She said strict enforcement kept property values high. She said rules meant nothing without consequences. No one argued with that. Instead, the homeowner stood and spoke again. He thanked her for caring about the neighborhood. Then he calmly explained the difference between enforcement and overreach. He explained process. He explained rights. He explained that rules mattered only when they were applied fairly and correctly. He didn't say her name. He didn't attack her character. He spoke only about actions and documents. Then he offered to share his records. The room went quiet again. This time it felt different. The chair asked if that would be helpful. Several people nodded. One board member said yes before the chair could finish the sentence. The HOA Karen objected, saying private matters should stay private. But the chair reminded everyone that HOA actions were not private when they affected the whole community. That was the first time anyone openly pushed back on her. Over the next week, emails flew back and forth. Documents were shared. Notices were compared. Timelines were laid out. Patterns became clear to anyone willing to look. The homeowner didn't flood inbox. He shared what was asked for, and nothing more. He let the facts speak. Some fines were found to have no warning attached. Some had no vote recorded. Some rules had been misquoted. Some complaints were clearly subjective. Enforced on one home and ignored on others, board members who had once assumed everything was fine began asking uncomfortable questions. The HOA Karen responded defensively at first. She claimed memory lapses. She blamed administrative errors. She said things had gotten busy, but the documents didn't agree with her explanations. Another meeting was scheduled. This one marked a special session. That alone made people nervous. The room was packed. People who had never spoken before sat in the front row. The homeowner arrived early and took a seat near the side. He didn't want attention. He didn't need it. The meeting opened with a summary of findings. The chair spoke slowly, carefully. They explained that several enforcement actions had not followed required steps. They explained that authority had been used improperly. No one mentioned her name yet. Then the chair said that corrective action was needed. The HOA Karen interrupted, standing up before being recognized. She said she was being targeted. She said this was unfair. She said she had only done what she thought was best. Her voice shook, not with sadness, but with anger. The chair asked her to sit down. That moment changed everything. For the first time, she looked unsure. The homeowner felt no joy in that. Only a strange calm. This wasn't revenge. This was balance being restored. One by one, board members spoke. Some apologized to the community. Some admitted they should have paid more attention. Some thanked homeowners for coming forward. Then the chair announced the decision. Enforcement authority would be paused temporarily. Fines under review would be reversed until properly reassessed. New procedures would be put in place. And one board member would be asked to step back from enforcement duties immediately. Everyone knew who that was. The HOA Karen sat frozen. Her face flushed. She opened her mouth, then closed it. She gathered her papers with stiff movements and sat down without another word. No one clapped. No one cheered. It wasn't that kind of moment. After the meeting, people stayed behind. They talked openly, some for the first time. Strangers exchanged phone numbers. Neighbors who had avoided each other for years now stood in small groups, sharing stories and laughing quietly. The homeowner stood near the exit, ready to leave. Several people thanked him. Some apologized for not speaking up sooner. One person said they felt safer now. That word stayed with him. Safe. Walking home, he noticed the street felt different. Not because the houses had changed, but because the weight had lifted. He unlocked his door and stepped inside, breathing deeply, for the first time in months. His home felt like his again. But the story wasn't over yet. A few days later, he received a message from the HOA. It was brief. It confirmed the reversal of his fines and stated that previous notices would be removed from record. No apology. No explanation. He didn't need one. Another message followed, sent to all homeowners. It outlined new enforcement guidelines and invited feedback. That invitation mattered. More than any fine reversal, the HOA Karen stopped attending meetings after that. When she did appear, she sat quietly, no longer speaking over others. She avoided eye contact with him. They never spoke again. He felt no need to confront her. The point had been made. Weeks passed. Lawns were still mowed. Trash cans still rolled out on schedule. Life went on. But something had changed beneath the surface. People asked questions now. They read emails more carefully. They showed up when things didn't feel right. The homeowner kept his files, even though he no longer needed them. He knew better than to assume problems never return, but he also knew this. Standing up didn't require shouting. It didn't require insults or threats. It required patience, facts, and the courage to stay steady when pressure tried to bend him. Someone once believed they could, trolled him quietly. They were wrong. And the neighborhood would never be the same because of it. The weeks after the special meeting felt quieter, but not empty. It was the kind of quiet that comes after a storm, when people step outside slowly to see what is still standing. The homeowner noticed it right away. Mornings felt lighter. He no longer dreaded opening his mailbox. He no longer checked his yard with a knot in his stomach. Nothing dramatic happened at first, and that was a good thing. The HOA sent out regular updates, but the tone had changed. The words were careful now, clear, less threatening. Notices focused on general reminders instead of single homes. When someone had a question, it was answered openly instead of behind closed doors. The homeowner stayed observant. He didn't relax too much. He had learned that power doesn't always disappear. Sometimes it just waits. A few fines were officially refunded. It happened quietly, through checks mailed out without comment. Some neighbors mentioned it in passing, surprised but relieved. Others said nothing. But the tension they carried for years seemed to lift from their shoulders. One evening, a neighbor knocked on his door. Not nervous this time. Just friendly. They talked about the weather, about small repairs, about how different the meetings felt now. Before leaving, the neighbor paused and said something simple. I didn't think one person could change things like that. The homeowner didn't know how to respond at first. He hadn't set out to be an example. He had only wanted peace in his own home. But he understood what the neighbor meant. Change often starts quietly, with someone refusing to be pushed any further. The HOA Karen kept her distance. When she did appear, it was brief. She no longer led discussions. She no longer corrected others. Her posture had changed. It's like someone who once filled a room and now tried to disappear into it. There were rumors that she planned to move. Others said she was just waiting for attention to fade. The homeowner didn't care either way. He had no interest in watching her fall. That chapter was closed. New board procedures were announced. Enforcement required written warnings, clear explanations, and documented votes. Homeowners were invited to review records if needed. Meetings included time for open questions, and those questions were answered without sighs or rolled eyes. Attendance stayed high. People realized that silence had never protected them. Participation did. One night, while taking a walk, the homeowner noticed lights on in several homes where they used to be dark. People were sitting on porches again, talking, laughing. It felt like a neighborhood, not a monitored space. He thought back to the nights he had sat alone at his kitchen table, surrounded by papers, wondering if he was doing the right thing. He remembered the fear, the doubt, the temptation to give in just to make it stop. Giving in would have been easier, but easier doesn't always mean better. Months passed. The HOA Karen resigned from the board without explanation. The email announcing it was short and neutral. No praise, no criticism. Just a statement. The homeowner read it once and closed his laptop. That was the end of it. A new board member was selected. Someone calm. Someone who listened more than they spoke. Meetings became shorter and more productive. Disagreements still happened, but they were handled respectfully. Life returned to normal. One afternoon, while cleaning out a drawer, the homeowner came across the old folders, letters, notices, photos, emails. He sat on the floor and flipped through them slowly. They felt distant now, like evidence from another life. He considered throwing them away instead. He placed them neatly back in the drawer, not as a reminder of anger, but as proof of what preparation and patience could do. Later that week, a new homeowner approached him after a meeting. They looked unsure, like he once had. They asked a few quiet questions about HOA rules and rights. He answered honestly, without drama. He encouraged them to read, to ask questions, to stay calm. As the person walked away, he realized something. What he had learned would keep moving forward. Even without him, that was the real victory. One evening, he sat on his porch as the sun dipped low. The street was peaceful. A child rode past on a bike. Someone waved. A dog barked in the distance. Ordinary sounds. Comforting sounds. His home felt safe again. Not because rules were gone, but because fairness had returned. He understood now that authority should never be feared. Only respected when it respects others in return. And when it doesn't, it can be challenged without becoming cruel or loud. Standing up didn't change who he was. It revealed who he already had been. Someone who valued his home. Someone who believed in fairness. Someone who refused to be quietly controlled. The story didn't end with applause or celebration. It ended with something better, peace, and sometimes. That's the strongest ending of all. Life settled into a steady rhythm after everything that had happened. Not exciting, not dramatic, just steady. And for the homeowner, that felt like a gift he had earned. Mornings returned to what they used to be. Coffee tasted better when it wasn't mixed with stress. He watered his plants without feeling watched. He left his house without wondering if a photo was being taken the moment he turned the corner. Still, he stayed aware. Experience had taught him that calm could be temporary if people stopped paying attention. The HOA continued operating under the new rules. Notices were rare and clearly written. When someone received one, it included photos, dates, and steps to fix the issue. No threats. No vague language. No shame attached. One day, a community email went out, asking for volunteers to help revise long-term guidelines. The homeowner read it twice before responding. He hesitated. He didn't want to be pulled back into something that had caused so much stress. But he also knew how quickly things could slide back if no one cared. He volunteered. The first working session was small. Only a few people showed up. They sat around a table with notebooks and coffee cups, talking quietly. There was no power struggle. No raised voices. Just people trying to understand what made sense and what didn't. As they reviewed the old rules, it became clear how confusing they were. Some were outdated. Some were written so loosely they could mean anything. Others contradicted each other. No wonder enforcement had gone wrong. The homeowner spoke when needed, sharing what he had learned, but he didn't dominate the room. He had no interest in becoming the kind of person he once stood up against. He listened more than he talked. That difference mattered. Word spread that the committee meetings were open and calm. More people began attending. They shared opinions without fear. Even when they disagreed, they stayed respectful. It felt strange. It's in a good way. Outside the meetings, the neighborhood continued to heal. People smiled more. They stopped whispering. Conversations moved from complaints to normal life again. Pairs, vacations, kids growing up, one afternoon. While checking the mail, the homeowner noticed an envelope addressed by hand. Inside was a short note from an older neighbor. It thanked him for standing up when others couldn't. It said they had lived there for a long time and had never felt so relieved. He folded the note carefully and placed it in the same drawer as his old files. Not everything returned to perfect. No place ever does. There were still disagreements, still frustrations, still moments when someone thought a rule was unfair. But now there was a system that allowed those concerns to be heard without punishment. That changed everything. Months later, during a regular HOA meeting, something unexpected happened. A homeowner stood up and challenged a proposed change calmly. They quoted the rules. They asked for clarification. They requested a delay for review. The board agreed. The homeowner, watching from his seat, felt a quiet pride. Not because of ego, but because the process worked. Because someone else felt safe enough to speak. That was the real sign of change. He thought back to the early days, when a single letter had felt like a threat, when silence had felt safer than honesty. He realized how much that experience had changed him, not in a bitter way, in a stronger way. He became more confident in other parts of life too. At work, he asked clearer questions. In conversations, he set firmer boundaries. He stopped apologizing for wanting fairness. One evening, he saw the former HOA Karen walking her dog down the street. It had been a long time. They passed each other without stopping. She nodded slightly. He nodded back. That was all. There was no anger left. No need to say anything. The moment passed quietly, like a chapter closing for good. Later that night, he sat on his porch again, watching the streetlights flicker on. The neighborhood felt alive, but not tense. Just alive. He thought about how easily things could have gone differently. How he could have sold the house. How he could have paid fines forever just to avoid conflict. How he could have believed the voice that told him it wasn't worth the trouble. Standing up had cost him sleep, time, and peace. At least for a while, but giving up would have cost him something deeper, respect for himself. He realized then that real power doesn't come from authority or titles. It comes from understanding the rules, staying calm under pressure, and refusing to be pushed into silence. People often imagine strength as loud or aggressive. He learned it could be quiet, patient, and steady. As the months turned into a year, the story faded into neighborhood memory. New homeowners moved in without knowing what had happened before. They only knew that meetings were fair and rules were clear. That was enough.